everyone. I'm Jade with HiveNation. HiveNation is an SAP marketplace built for consultants by consultants. We're here to help every independent SAP consultant like yourself to not only find your next project, but also help you to grow your income, your skills, and your network. On this show, we bring on the world's experts to discuss everything from how to implement the latest trends in SAP and technology into your everyday operations, to helping you take your career in SAP to the next level. Check us out and join today at HiveNation. So welcome everyone. In this episode, we'll be discussing how implementing inclusive policies on your team can boost engagement, creativity, and productivity. We have an incredible guest with us today. She's worked in technology for over 30 years. She's worked specifically as a DEI technologist for over 10 years. She's also a consultant and strategist who has helped multiple enterprises thrive by creating an inclusive and equitable culture. But her most significant accomplishment is being an auntie to 19 nieces and nephews. Do I have that right? 19?
19, yes.
Wow. I'm at 0, big old donut hole. So I've got a bit of catching up to do. But in addition to that, she's also been able to remain relevant after starting her career as a COBOL programmer. That is the OG of programming. So we have got with us someone who has seen it all in the world of technology, and we are so lucky to have you. Please welcome Cynthia Strickland. Thank you, Cynthia, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jade. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
This is a really, really, really important topic that I feel, especially in technology, gets overlooked. Am I right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so when talking about implementing inclusive policies, I think we have to take it a step back, right? And we first have to talk about exclusivity and bias. And what exactly is bias? You know, that word gets thrown around a lot, and a lot of people have very different meanings to describe what bias is.
Sure.
But how, more specifically, does that present in the workplace for SAP consultants?
Yeah, bias, you can go by a standard definition around a tendency to look at things a certain way. It could be people, it could be process. There's an inclination maybe against something, maybe not based on facts, but just how you feel about it. And so how it can show up, it's interesting, it can show up on multiple dimensions. It can show up in an organization as a bias towards different units of the organizations. So you could have the product group having a bias against the engineering group. It can come down and be distilled from there into individuals, from an engineer to a program manager. So there's layers to the bias, and so it is something that you have to address at multiple levels to truly address it.
Yeah, I guess I've always thought of it as more individual, being a female in technology, person of color, female technology. But I guess I never thought about bias presenting itself as almost like high school cliques within the company, and how damaging that can be to just productivity and the company as a whole.
So that is what you're talking about. That's another layer up. So that is at a group level. And really, and that's a great example around high school cliques, because at the group level, groups are what dominate things. That's how people flow as well. What's the group doing? But the group's made up then of individuals. And so that's why you have to look at it holistically. You can't just go and address the group without addressing the people in the group.
And it always comes back down to that individual. I think another word to get some clarity around that also, especially today, gets used a lot is this term privilege. It's a firecracker term, right? So can you explain a little bit what is privilege? I think we've seen from a lot of groups who do have privilege not really understand it as such, and it may feel, if you have privilege, like being right-handed versus left-handed, it may feel like you're losing certain things in the workplace. But I'll defer to you. How would you define privilege?
The purest definition will be having an advantage, being able to gain something that someone else can't because of just who you are. But I had an instructor who defined it as an invisible package of unearned assets. And so I love that one instead, because it's like, where'd you get it from? And how did you attain it? And if you can't answer that, then it's probably a privilege. It's some entitlement potentially, as opposed to a real privilege. And so it's something that somebody doesn't have, somebody else doesn't have. And the challenge we have now is answering the why. Why is that? How did you acquire that? Um, if I take a full step back with you, the real key around DEI, at least from a strategist and a practitioner standpoint, is you got to be curious. You're almost that 2-year-old, which I'm adept at being childlike, of why, why? Because you're breaking down layers and layers of how did you arrive at this level? Let's see what's underneath that. And let's get to the root of where it's coming from.
And addressing that, because you're right. I mean, awareness only starts with curiosity.
Right.
Can you define DEI?
DEI is, at least the way I define it, I can only own the way I look at it at this point, is how do you position or create a workspace where there are diverse people who are included and feel like they belong and are treated equitably. And that all sounds really good. But what I think gets lost is we only look at certain dimensions around that. We tend to talk around race and gender and ethnicity, but there you can see some definitions where there's 30 dimensions of diversity. And, I haven't talked about ableism. I haven't talked about neurodiversity. There's so many layers and areas that you have to consider, because you could have two brown people in the room, but they're diverse within that. So there's intersectionality to it also,
Yep.
is what I'm trying to address. So there's a multitude of components that make up diversity. That's fine. And I want to put that separate. What's really most important, in my opinion, is the inclusion and equity part.
Yep.
Because we're all different and we're bringing some unique value to the table. How is that being recognized? How is that being enabled? How are people being seen so that they can bring that diversity to the table? So how are they being included, and are they being listened to and seen at the same rate as the person next to them? And that's the equity, in that process. So diversity, we can talk about till the cows come home. It's how are you then taking advantage of that by including people and making it an equitable opportunity for all people in the process.
I love that you broke it down even more, saying that there are two brown people, but there's so many more layers to that. And I'm glad you brought up neurodivergent, because I feel like education today as well, not to go off on a total
Right.
tangent about
Yeah.
education, but it really doesn't account for that. But that carries into the workforce, because that's not readily seen, or readily even talked about. Some people don't even know that they're not neurotypical. And most neurotypical people don't even know that they are. So to shed light on that here, and especially in the workforce in a managerial position, I think is so important. And now being aware, so let's say, you're a manager and you have a team of consultants under you, and you're aware of this. Are there policies in place? Are there things that you can do, like tangible, actionable items as a leader and even fellow team members, to create a more inclusive environment?
Sure. And that's again where we all own a role in making that happen. So as a leader, it's asking the question. It's having the courage to ask of the team, do you feel included? Do you feel that this team embraces you? And you have to then also have a level of maturity and an emotional, a high EQ, to understand that when you ask that question, everyone may not answer, because of their level of comfort and trust. And so you have to allow different avenues for that communication to take place. You can put it in the broad team spectrum. You can also say, I'm available one-on-one. You can also provide, if it's just email. What I strongly push back against is, don't make it anonymous, because this is trying to build teaming, and this is trying to build trust. And so you do have to engage with people, but you have to meet them where they are. So you start there with the conversation. You also have to provide opportunities for people to be part of the team, and so that requires, as a manager, you spend some time and find those opportunities. Is it speaking? Is it presenting a solution? You have to find ways that allow that person to show up in the best way that they can. And when you do that, you have to understand culturally some of the things and some of the challenges people may have doing that. We briefly touched on neurodiversity. I'm an introvert. I call myself a social introvert. So I'm not going to necessarily jump up and down and raise my hand to speak. And so that doesn't mean I don't have something to say. So you need to start understanding, how are the ways that I can reach people to come out of whatever they need to embrace and be part of the team.
You brought up a great point about being an introvert, because there's some great memes going around, especially during this time of the pandemic, how extroverts have typically ruled the world. And you're absolutely right. The only way that we're going to foster creativity and novel ideas and actually push the company forward with new projects and new solutions is to include everybody. So you were saying to reach out to people, possibly even one on one. After having that conversation of basic understanding, or actually within that conversation, is there anything that a manager or even a team member having this conversation with a fellow team member, is there anything that they should ask right off the gate? Do you have a list of things that should be covered in that conversation, or things that they shouldn't ask? Things that might be inappropriate or a little too sensitive.
Yeah, there probably are things that would be inappropriate, and I could probably find resources for that. What's most important in that interaction is one of the models we call dialogue and resonance, and it's really just listening. It's being present, it's listening intently, and it's then paraphrasing what you've heard. And what you'll find is, through that, you may say something, they're like, no, that's not what I meant, which is great, because they're going to really go deeper into what they're thinking or what their needs are. If you're talking to people from other cultures, yeah, it's probably great to do some general awareness of norms. And one of the things I was going to mention when you're talking about policies, what you could start with as a manager, and what, and that trickles down to the individuals, is how do you want to engage with each other as teammates? So when I'm saying, how do you pull things out of that person that's being quiet, that may have the answer to all the problems, is you institute rules around no one can be interrupted, and each person is going to get an opportunity to speak. And if you don't understand, you'll say it, and understand that that person may take some time before they come back with an answer. So you introduce these rules of engagement that slow things down and give everyone an opportunity to participate. And I want to shout out to the extroverts. I have no issue with extroverts whatsoever, because that's the balance. That's the yin and yang. I'm great with that. It's the what's the missed opportunity with that person that is an introvert. And the last thing I'll say about that is, I'm saying introvert from an American lens,
Right.
versus other cultures. Maybe that's just the way we are. I don't have another label for that. And so that's okay too. But we here as Americans will call that introvert, where it could be the cultural norm somewhere else. And it's that building that awareness that will help you understand your team better and be able to team better.
My parents are not from America, and they were telling me a little bit about their experiences coming over here, and even just in language. They're both speaking English, but I think my mom said when she first came in here, she would say embrace instead of the word hug. And so she got a lot of laughs when she was a kid. And it's
Mhm.
little things like that, and she didn't understand because she's speaking English, and it's little things like that that can really shut a person down, even if they are an extrovert. But these are great policies to start off with, where first, as you mentioned, do your research, become aware of the people on your team, and then call them in individually, and then set up rules of engagement for the entire team. And would you have to facilitate these types of engagements within your team members as well, or do you kind of take a hands-off approach there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You can set a framework. I would recommend you take somewhat of a hands-off approach because this is how the team's going to work. And it's also showing them and empowering them that, yeah, I want to understand, how do you want to work with each other? And so that then forces that development of a relationship within the team. I watched that happen with one of my teams, and it was amazing to watch how they then became more intentional in how they engaged with each other. And that's that resonance and dialogue. It's like really focused on what someone else is saying because you're purposeful in coming to an agreement amongst yourself, and you're learning about the things that are important to your other teammates and how they work. And it's those aha moments of, oh, so that's probably why you weren't talking to me, because I wasn't really connecting with you because I was talking over you, and so you felt shut down, and so you just stopped.
And I think that leads into, how these policies really help the team boost their engagement, creativity, and productivity. It's exactly what you said. Just nodding your head, make them go away, but then missing some tasks in the process. So before we expound on that a little bit more, I just had a question about leaders and taking that hands-off approach. Have you seen in your experience, if you're not dictating exactly, hey, team members, you should meet up one-on-one to talk about XYZ, have you seen just by leading by example that team members within the project start taking some cues from their leader and enacting on these on their own?
Yeah, they do. So that's where, again, as the leader, there's a lot of work that you have to do about how you show up. And so
Mhm.
the awareness that you're doing around understanding your team, you have to do that awareness for yourself. So as a D&I practitioner, it sounds good and I get to tell you all these great things. I can tell you though, every day I have to challenge myself, or I am challenged in saying, how have I shown up? What did I do or say that may have been construed in a way I did not want it to be? And so you're constantly taking a pulse of how you've engaged. One of the things, another tool from DEI is tracking, and tracking is really being observant of other people's behavior, but you also are looking at, and what's my behavior within that thing, so that you're constantly looking at how may bias be showing up in you and how can you address it, because the more you understand you, the better you can help the other people understand some of the things that they may be exhibiting.
Right.
So that's part of what the team leader has to do, is make sure first they're really grounded in some awareness of their bias. It doesn't mean that it's been corrected. That's a lifelong practice. Somebody tells you, yeah, once you know it, you'll stop it. That's just not true. It shows up in other forms, as you move on. So you just have to constantly acknowledge it and say, what am I going to do with it? And then keep moving and keep growing, in that process. So as you're doing that, your team's going to see that, because you have to have, again, that maturity to acknowledge, I just did something to someone, or I said something and it came back to me, and I want to bring this up to the group and say, here's what I meant by it, but my impact to somebody may have been different. And I want to make sure they are aware. So then what happens is, as you are demonstrating your awareness to your team, you may have scenarios where you've recognized you've said something that, as you thought about it, it could have hurt someone. It could have been impactful in a non-positive way. And so what that does is it allows you to say, hey, this happened. No one said anything, but I want to go back to it because I think it could have come across in a non-positive way, and I want to talk about that and what my real intent was. But what's not important is my intent. What is most important is, what was the impact. And sometimes when you come back and address something like that, people will open up because it's there. Oh, so you do know you may have said something. Great. Now we can talk about it, because there's sometimes a lot of fear. You're looking at hierarchical constructs where people who really believe in that say, I can't say something to the manager. But if the manager says something about what they said, well, then that's my opening to then have that conversation.
Right. So I guess from a manager's point of view, it's really important to have daily check-ins with yourself, and even after every team meeting or before every team meeting, to just question yourself constantly and be aware.
I think you've seen my notes and how I operate, and really that's a key practice. Every meeting is a check-in. And you have to manage that, because you can check in all day because people have things they really want to talk about. So you can move the more serious component of a check-in, and what I really call the checkout. How are you now after the meeting? And that's after a technical meeting, because maybe that eases some stress and tension that the person came into the meeting with. How are you now? Do you have more questions than answers, or is this helping you directionally go and resolve a problem?
And how would you phrase questions like that? I know culturally, especially in technology, being very agreeable is very
Yes,
common.
it does. And so what you can do is ask questions around, if you had time to do something a different way, how would you do it? To again, press and probe. And in addition, one group I was doing a bias training with, and a question came back around speaking in their own language, whatever their own language is, and how sometimes people are put off by that. And I said, what you could do is in advance say, what you've just asked me doesn't translate well into my language. So I'm going to say this in my language to one of my counterparts to make sure I understand what you just said. I said, just say it to let people know this is why we have to take this sidebar. We're not just talking in the meeting to each other just to talk. It is because I don't understand in certain nuances in the language, and I need to bounce this off of somebody who I know may understand better. And so that's another part of, you may think you're asking a question and then you're just getting someone being agreeable saying yes, and it's because maybe they don't understand the question quite the same way. And that happens. That happens in English, let alone in numerous other languages. So it's that grace of, you know what, Cynthia or Jay, give me a second. I need to ask someone else that to translate that a little bit differently for me before I answer you. So those are ways of making sure, one, do you understand it? And if you don't, that's okay. And maybe you learn a new word that, oh, that word's really more this, so that everybody hears, oh, that's a better way to ask that question going forward, so that we have clarity. But it's asking, if you had another way of doing something, how would you do it, so that people can be open to saying, well, I really wish we could use open source. I really wish we could do more QA testing before we move it into what next level of the platform before it goes to production. You just constantly asking questions of what ifs.
After receiving a note like that from your team as a manager, so what happens when a solution they're presenting to you isn't something that you plan on using? How do you let them down gently, so to speak, without closing the door to their creativity and ability to present future solutions?
Sure, that's going to happen. And so, what I would do is challenge them to continue to iterate on the solution and reinforce it's not for what we're working on now. It's not the avenue we're going to take, but it could be useful for other solutions. So I would ask them to continue to test and iterate and present that at a later meeting to the group, to say this is how this solution could be used for alternative problems, and we would have it in our back pocket. So it's really just not saying no, but saying not yet, not now. And that iteration, again, coming from agile methodology, keep working on that. That's in your back pocket, and you get an opportunity later to present your thinking and how that solution could help the team.
Yeah, I think that encouragement is super important, because I've seen too where if someone on the team continually gets shut down with their new ideas, you're not going to be able to come up with any novel solutions. It's always going to be what the manager wants, and that's not always what's best for the project.
Yeah, that's I just want to add on that. That can be challenging in technical teams, especially with your lead technologist who thinks their way is the way. And so you really have to manage both ends of making sure that that lead technology person is open to other ways of doing things. And things aren't always linear. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. There are different ways of approaching a solution. And there's a learning opportunity always for everyone involved in the process. And so it's also letting that technical expert know you're an expert and you'll continue to be an expert because you're able to learn. So be open to alternatives. And it's also your opportunity to teach and mentor and coach people when they're maybe not seeing fully how a solution can be developed.
So for people who are experiencing bias currently, how can they shift to have a more respectful conversation or even set boundaries without fear of repercussions?
First thing is if you're experiencing bias, it's not for you to shift anything. That's not your problem. It's the initiator, and that's a role in the bias. It's the initiators. It's their responsibility to shift and to learn and to grow. I did a bias training, and I used a book I read. It's called Subtle Acts of Exclusion. And so they termed it that instead of microaggressions because people are offended by the word microaggression. That's offensive in and of itself, right? The irony. So within the book, what it does is it communicates everyone's role in what just happened. We tend to say, did that what just happened? Did that just happen? Yes, it did. And who is responsible in that action? Well, number one is the initiator, the person who said it. Okay. Then it's the subject, the person who received it. And there's potentially two more roles. There's a observer, there's somebody that might have been there that observed it all. And there's another person that's a bystander. And what I mean by bystander, they're an observer too, but both the observer and the bystander have an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
They can choose to engage and become an ally. And that it takes learning and practice to do that. But ultimately, the person who initiated this aggression or this act of exclusion really has to then pause and understand that no one wants to hear about their intent, what they meant to do. What really has to happen is they have to understand the impact to that person. So that that person, then when you're asking what's the guardrails for that person that happened to, the guardrails are they can choose to potentially say, what you just said did this to me, and I either don't appreciate it, whatever their response is to acknowledge it and say, here's how it made me feel, and here's what I would appreciate you do in the future. Or the subject has the guardrails to say, I'm not going to deal with you. That's okay because maybe they don't feel safe doing it, or they're just, why do I have to educate you on what you just did to me? That's, you go become educated on why that was not appropriate. So there are guardrails, there are things that the subject of the exclusion can take. There are things that the initiator needs to do, and then there are the roles of the people sitting around, because silence, as they say, silence is violence. It is assumed that you're condoning whatever just happened if you're silent. And that may seem unfair, but that's the way it works. You can also decide to engage and say, hey, I just saw what happened. I think we should talk about it. Maybe it's not right now, but let's come back. And meanwhile, I'll talk to you, initiator, on why that probably was not an appropriate thing to do. The thing I want that person to learn is once you do that and you are considered an ally, you don't get to walk that line back and forth, because what happens is then you lose the trust of that person going forward. Now they're trusting that this person is going to have my back, be on my side, be able to help me communicate maybe when I can't in that situation.
Right.
And the first time you don't, the trust is broken. So it is a big role. It doesn't mean I'm saying everybody should take it if it's something that you can't do. But I want people to understand that that thing that just went into the ether is owned by everyone sitting and standing there. It is not owned by the person it happened to. And the more we learn how that's not my fault. I don't have to shift it because that's the responsibility of this person that needs to get some further awareness and understanding.
So for people that, you know, don't necessarily speak up, because you're right, you are absolutely right. It is not their responsibility. What are some signs that managers can look out for? You know, if they don't know what they don't know, are there things, signs that they can see in behavior that'll clue them that they do have some bias towards an individual?
Yeah, there may or may not, because that's again around how aware are they, and if they're saying that there's something lost in that awareness. So, uh, I think some of the typical reactions can be withdrawal, just lack of engaging. I think it's going to be more of those scenarios you may see, especially now because we're virtual. People don't have their cameras on. That's a protection that they'll have, is that you may say it, but I don't have to see it. I won't have my camera on. You can't see me. So that part of the hurt, you don't get to see anymore. So you may see more of those types of behavior, tracking again, how often has person X said anything? So it's going to be those types of activities or lack of that may catch the attention of the person doing it. But that's the hard part of the virtual working, is really being able to see some of the reaction. And maybe it's not again on that person, maybe that person will see the reaction of others, of how they may cringe or look around and say, react to whatever said. That's probably what's going to get their attention more so than the person that they did it to.
That's a good point. If other people are cringing, but I guess that's where those daily check-ins come in really handy as well, right? So as a leader, what can you do for your team if the company of the project you're on doesn't practice any type of inclusion? Is there any way to instill that within your team and almost protect your members from a, for lack of a better word, but a somewhat toxic environment?
Yeah, it's so if you're in a company where they may have DEI representation, and it will depend on the size of the organization, if there's a chief DEI officer, or if there's a VP, or if there's a program manager, or even a consultant. If you do have access, go and talk to those folks so that they can help you with ways of engaging. There are a number of models available, but first step is assessing where are you and what your needs might be so that they can help you more practically. The other piece, then, if that's not available, is we all use Google. Okay, I'm going to say it. We all use. You can look these things up and see, how can I get help? Maybe how can I do something to influence the situation. And so I think managers, that middle layer, have the challenge and the opportunity of, they get to come in and influence the team, but they also get the opportunity to influence above and say, this is what's happening. This is what I'm using to help relieve or release some of this toxicity. Might you consider doing this and perpetuating this throughout? And here are some tools I've seen, or some companies I've seen, consulting I've seen, to help do that. So it's not going to be easy, and you have to do it where you are. So if you are a manager and your team is toxic, absolutely focus on your team and let them become an example of how things could be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you can potentially influence upward. But I'm not going to profess that it will always work. But if you can get your team to work, that's really
Right.
what you're trying to do
Right.
initially.
So, how does awareness of bias and implementing these inclusive policies, both for the team and for one's own daily practice, how does that really actually improve one's work, their network, and ultimately their career?
Yeah, it's implementing. I've implemented a lot of systems and solutions that the next day the client said, "Thank you, we will potentially use it." So I'm saying that to say implementing, you can implement anything. The difference is operationalizing it, and I am, and you can call it semantics, but it's how do you make it part of the utility in the everyday practice. So how do you operationalize these things? And so it's the checking in, it's the norms, it's what are things that are going to be in front of you as a policy that I am representing that policy daily. So you'll have HR policies and you'll have company missions, and you'll have to look at how do you distill that down to the team so that they are reinforcing it. And so, like, I have something here, it's called Live Inclusively. It's a coaster, but behind this coaster are key things that I can look at that say, have you done this today? Have you committed to this? Are you speaking up, speaking out? Are you empathetic to the experiences and perspective of others? It is reinforcements. Maybe 5 or 10 things that I can look at before Zoom's coming up and saying, let me check myself out today. Have I been living in the space that we said we're living in to enact these policies? So it's not just implemented, and it's, does anybody know where to find this on the OneDrive? It's how is it operating within the team, and how, those 5 to 10 things, if you have them readily available, and it might be even when the meeting comes up, that's the first thing that comes up. Check, everybody, have you seen this? Yeah, push it away. You have to continually drive it home, so that when somebody's not doing it, we don't call it calling them out, we call it calling them in and saying, hey, I don't know if you noticed, but that's not really what we said we were going to do. Let me just throw this up again. Or you can throw it in chat to somebody and say, dude, this is what's going on. Let me call you in on that and we can talk about it, so that people understand. It is, I don't think you meant that maybe, and this is how it landed, and this is that line here. Just think about it. And hit me up on chat, Slack, whatever it is you're using to collaborate, so that people feel like they can talk about it. But I don't want it implemented. I want it operationalized.
It's a great, great distinction. And great note about the chat. I feel like that's our virtual version of whispering.
Right. Yeah.
Although just be careful when you're whispering something that you're not accidentally sending it to everyone. But yeah, this was fantastic. Mainly both for the team as a whole, for the manager, the leader, how to really engage your team, but also as a consultant, a part of a team. How do you feel heard, knowing that, and just listening to you and realizing, knowing that it's not on you, but there are avenues to go to when you're not feeling heard, so you can grow your network, because a lot of networking is being able to develop relationships with people you see as your own leaders, who will then take you on to other projects and ultimately growing your career. So thank you, Cynthia, for coming on board.
Thanks, Jade.
We will actually provide some of these resources, that checklist that you had mentioned, in our HiveNation community. That's a great way to keep yourself accountable. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you to everyone for listening. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your insights on how we can better develop ourselves, our team, and ultimately our company. Everyone, our next show will be announced on both our site, hivenation.com, and in our HiveNation community app. Download the app today to stay up to date with the latest SAP trends, learn new practical solutions, and network with our SAP experts like Cynthia. She is one of our newest community leaders, here to help everyone implement DEI into their operations. So feel free to send us any questions or requests to community@hivenation.com. Until next time, this is Jade with HiveNation, a platform built for SAP consultants by consultants.